Thanks so much for this invitation. This is my first time at Cornell, first time in Ithaca, despite having had some friends of mine that I grew up with who are graduates of Cornell, one in the class of '79, and another one graduate of Ithaca in voice in '81, went on to be an opera singer. So this is pretty cool. My immediate impressions of Ithaca, very hilly. I mean, these are some serious hills. I can't imagine what it's like when you have a snowstorm. Makes for easy sledding, I would take it, going down the hill. And good beer. I did try some beer. I know this is near Southern Tier Brewery somewhere not too far from here. So that's good. And thank you, Rashay, for, where did you go? Oh, there you are. For lunch today. And I think I surprised you with my love affair of your hometown and home state of Montgomery, Alabama, where I just find the history of Alabama, the history of Mississippi, the history of Georgia, the whole Black Belt South as we know it, to be fascinating. So thank you all for this. But just a little bit more about me so you know my approach to sports. And I should say in the beginning, I actually love sports. I really do. And last night when I got back to the hotel, I watched baseball, I watched football, I watched the WNBA finals, all of it. Because sometimes people hear me talk about sports and they go, you don't like sports. No, I like sports. But sports are very important. And I try to focus on the critical nature of sports. And so that's what I'm going to try and do today. So just a little bit more about me. I started out as a journalist dedicated to investigating and writing about issues revolving around racial and other social issues in our society at a small but powerful, unfortunately now defunct publication in Chicago called the Chicago Reporter, not to be confused with the Chicago Defender. We did all investigative reporting, won all kinds of awards, pushed Chicago and its suburbs to make, and the state of Illinois, to make the correct corrections when it came to issues of race, poverty, and inequality. But along the way, I turned into a journalist reporting and opining about sports. And then by chance, I morphed into this TV talking head on ESPN. I try not to scream. And disembodied voice on NPR from time to time chatting about sports. And last year I started co-hosting a podcast, Rashay will like this, called Our New South, about the latest iteration of this phrase. Now this has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about today. That's just a shameless plug for our program, Our New South, which you can get on where your platforms, wherever you get your podcasts. And then about 15 years ago, I got dragged into teaching journalism, specifically sports journalism at the University of Maryland. I had moved back home from having been in Dallas for 20 years, and the Washington Post sports editor for a long time, the legendary George Solomon, has started a sports journalism program at the University of Maryland. He asked me if I would be interested in teaching. I said, absolutely not. And he kept badgering me as only George Solomon can do. And to make him go away, I applied for the job. Next thing I know, I'm in interviews. Next thing I know, I get the job. And then I'm turning to friends of mine in academia saying, what do I do now? I don't have a syllabus. I don't know how to run a classroom. I don't know what to do. And so I did a lot of listening and a lot of soul searching. And I teach 2 courses there. In the spring, I teach sports reporting and writing, which is a skills course, where I teach the tools of and philosophy of sports reporting in the class, and I kick students out to cover high school sports, college sports, professional sports. And just the other year, I finally got them to cover something I really love, and you don't know this, NASCAR. We went to Richmond to cover a NASCAR race, which is amazing. And if you ever want to know about the importance of NASCAR in society, read a guy by the name of Josh Newman. He's a scholar at Florida State. He's written brilliantly about white supremacy and NASCAR and how that's been dealt with in our society. But all this takes me back to my original interest of being a journalist. With the research tools available to me in academia, as well as my bag of investigative tools from being a trained veteran journalist. I've even joined some of my former colleagues in Chicago at the Chicago Reporter, and we've recreated what we once had and loved, and we call it the Investigative Project on Race and Equity in Chicago. And so our first project that we had young reporters do was on traffic stops in Chicago and in the state of Illinois. And they created a database which you can go into right now and try and find your own locale. And obviously, not surprisingly, what did we find? We found that there was a great deal of racial disparity in the traffic stops, particularly by Chicago cops and in some other cities. And the reason we did that was because when Barack Obama was a state senator, he passed a bill in Illinois to make police departments keep track of their traffic stops. And what these students found, this young cadre of new investigative reporters, was that police stations just began to ignore that. And so now we're trying to spur them to get back to that regulation, that law. So I say all this to inform you of where I've come and where I'm at in the sports journalism landscape. And if there's one thing that I've learned in recent years, of which I am absolutely sure, it is that when I look through the lens of race and equity at college sports, I see most black athletes, most black male athletes who are headed to college or who are already there have been bamboozled and hoodwinked. Now, why do I say that? Well, let me share with you a few numbers from research done by a friend of mine at USC, Professor Sean Harper, and maybe some of you know him. And he's done this over a period of time since he was at Penn and now at USC with his doctoral students. And this will evidence the trick bag into which black athletes have cast their immediate future. It is that, generally speaking, young black men make up less than 3% of all undergraduate students at major colleges and universities. Less than 3%. Some of you may know that. And the major colleges and universities I'm talking about are those 65, 69 colleges that we refer to as the Power Four. We used to call them the Power Five. And they're all the usual suspects, the big state schools and some of the private schools that play sports along with them. But those same young black men count for more than 50 and upwards of 60% of the men's basketball and football teams. In other words, the overwhelming reason black males are students on a college campus at all is not to be part of the learning class, but to be part of the working class. The working class known as the college athlete, who is vastly under-remunerated for his work. And to further illustrate this condition, consider that those two revenue-generating sports, football and basketball, that black male athletes predominate, brought in the bulk of what economists estimated just 5 years ago was more than $15 billion in college sports revenue. $1 billion. That's 5 years ago. Today, it's probably 20 billion. But of that 15 plus billion, less than 3 billion, or about 18%, went to the athletes in the form of scholarships. And no more than 1% went towards medical treatment and insurance protections. So you might ask yourself, I think, Rashay, you asked this today. So where did most of that $15 billion go? To other sports is where it went. As a friend of mine, Richard Southall at the University of South Carolina says, who studies this stuff, there are two types of sports on a college campus. There's the revenue-generating sports, football and basketball, and then there are the expenditure sports, all the sports that cost a university money to run, and which run off of the largesse of those two sports. And those expenditure sports, women's sports for the most part, other field sports like field hockey, lacrosse, baseball, wrestling, crew, etc., are sports not played in great numbers by the athletes whose labor makes them possible, the black male athlete. So it is in that context, as I kind of drawing you a picture here, that the model of the plantation economy can in fact be applied to big-time college athletics. Black football and basketball players harvesting the money in stadiums and arenas and bringing it back to the big house for all there to share. Mostly white women and white men playing sports they don't and administering athletics that divvy up the money harvested that they rake in. Ostensibly, black male athletes are at least supposed to get a seal of higher education approval as readily as their classmates for their toil on the campus. But even there, not surprisingly, is a shortcoming. Only about 53% of black male athletes in general graduate within 6 years. Their academic success rate pales in comparison to every other cohort on campus, be it racial, gender, or even athletic. 68% of all athletes graduate within 6 years. It doesn't really matter what college or university they choose. Harper's research, through those several years old now, found that over one particular period, the University of Miami and my alma mater, Northwestern, were the only schools that graduated black athletes at a rate higher than or equal to the rest of the college body. So 2/3 of universities graduated black male athletes at rates lower than black undergraduate men who were not paying their way through college with blood and sweat. So the education of black athletes is not a priority for just about any college they choose. Those are indeed sweet nothings that coaches vying for signatures on letters of intent whisper into their ears. But here's the thing. They don't have to give in to seduction. Not if colleges can supply the NFL and the NBA with black ready-made talent. If colleges can do that, they can do the same for our sciences, our school systems, our governments, our professions, our vocations. They can provide those entities with black ready-made intellectual, professional, vocational talent if they ever recruit and train black males in the arts and sciences, engineering, medicine, media, etc., like they do in football and basketball. They can point to MacArthur Award winners, just like they do All-Americas and national championships. But athletes shouldn't wait for that altruism to rain down on them. Those numbers aren't all on the colleges and universities they might choose and the coaches for whom they decide to play. They don't have to do themselves and their families a disservice. They can exercise self-determination and play the system rather than let the system play them. They have political and economic weight to move universities that want them to produce revenue and championships, more so now than ever before, because of all the riches and wealth they are generating for the system in which they play. Ole Miss football players, led by their majority black teammates, marched and boycotted practice a few years ago to protest yet another police shooting of a black man, that time Jacob Blake, a Wisconsin man who was shot 7 times in the back by a Kenosha police officer. You may recall that incident prompted black NBA players who were then in the COVID bubble to stop playing. Then some black Ole Miss football players straightened their backs and demanded the removal of Confederate monuments in Mississippi. We can step up, defensive end Ryder Anderson said. We can use our voice. Use our platform. Together, we are really strong. We can really make stuff happen if we just come together. Kylan Hill, who was the star Mississippi State running back at the time, said that he was no longer willing to represent an institution that uses the Confederate flag. And guess what? As the vocal commotion of the black college football players at Mississippi's flagship institutions rose, they found allies. Who? Their coaches, the men who make their living off their backs. The coaches and administrators from Mississippi universities lobbied legislators to vote to remove the Confederate symbol on the state flag, something people have been fighting for decades. And guess what happened after all those years? It got erased. That's the power black college athletes have. That's the flex they need to make. You may have heard those of us in the media praise a former North Carolina basketball star by the name of Rashad McCants. That was a few years ago. He was the second leading scorer in the Tar Heels 2005 national championship team. We in the media praised him mostly, though, for being a historic whistleblower, for telling one of my employers, ESPN, that tutors wrote his term papers, that he rarely went to class for about half his time in North Carolina, that he remained able to play largely because he took bogus classes designed to keep athletes academically eligible. McCants revealed that he could have been academically ineligible to play during the championship season had he not been provided all that assistance. He said his head coach at the time, Roy Williams, who I know and like, knew about the paper class system at Chapel Hill, knew the so-called paper classes didn't require students to go to class, that instead the players were required to submit only one term paper to receive a passing grade. McCants also told ESPN that he even made the dean's list in the spring of 2005 despite not attending any of his 4 classes for which he received straight A's. I laugh, but it's sad. He said advisors and tutors worked with the basketball program, steered him to take the paper classes in the African American Studies program. And everything McCants said mirrored an investigation report in 2011 by the Raleigh News and Observer about widespread academic fraud in North Carolina centered on the African American Studies classes, and that many black athletes who took then in order to remain eligible. The newspaper further reported that black basketball players on the national championship team accounted for 15 enrollments in those classes. The university internal investigation found that 54 classes in the Department of African American Studies were either aberrant or irregularly taught for 5 years. And I stand here, as we're reminded, at ground zero of the successful fight on college campuses to get the legitimate discipline of African American studies recognized next to every other discipline. Black academics and their allies put their careers on the line for these studies. I used to sit at the knee of Manning Marable, who was a research student here, a research professor, I believe, research associate here. I first met Manning Marable at a journalism conference at Hunter College. I used to be in this organization called the National Alliance of Third World Journalists. And I was just taken by his brilliance and his ability to dissect things in a whole different way. And then when I became an economics writer in Dallas, I began to call on Manning to provide a different lens to discussing the national economy, because he was a political economist. And it was great, another voice, a different voice. And I've gotten to know so many scholars in African American studies over the years. At Northwestern, we had Sterling Stuckey. I took Faulkner with Leon Forrest. right? All these great people. Alice Palmer, who kind of bequeathed Barack Obama to politics in the state of Illinois, was one of my mentors. And so I was really angered when I read that the African American Studies Department had been used in this manner. And I know the pain that brought to people across this country who work in this endeavor. And so that was really maddening, and it still makes me mad today when I think about it. But I digress. How problematic was this to the people who lorded over college sports? The NCAA penalized the football program for improper benefits and academic misconduct involving a tutor, but it left the athletic department programs largely unscathed by this academic scandal, this academic malfeasance. In other words, let me say it again, the education of black athletes in college is not a priority for just about any college they choose. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I want you to look up this book. It's titled Unsportsmanlike Conduct, Exploiting College Athletes. And you know who wrote it? A guy named Walter Byers. You know who Walter Byers was? He was the architect of the modern day NCAA. He lorded over the NCAA for 36 years until he retired in 1987. And his book is like a memoir, or maybe even you could call it a confessional, because it lays out how the multi-billion-dollar college industrial sports complex was built by black football and basketball players, black athletes in particular, making cheddar off of them while what? Bringing student athletes, so it sounded, or making the phrase student athlete so that it sounded as if they were getting something invaluable in return, and they wouldn't use their status to sue for workers' compensation, long-term health benefits, or a paycheck like everyone else who puts in a 40-hour work week on campus. So as a longtime addicted fan to college sports, as well as a longtime sports writer who has railed about fraudulent academics and athletics, I wasn't surprised by McCants' revelation. Sham courses and fake passing grades, we've all heard it before. But now that I'm also a college professor, my criticism is conflictual. I've learned that athletes expect and get special treatment the few times I've had athletes in my classes at the University of Maryland. If it is their season, they present me with a letter from the athletic department. It says that they'll be unavailable for class on this date and that date as they perform their athletic duties for the school. And I'm asked to sign this agreement, and I always have, always will. But it made me think, if any other college student told me they couldn't make all my classes because they had other stuff to do, I'd probably tell them to go find another class, right? But that's not the way this system works. And I've developed a personal commitment of fairness to all students to help them. I want their education to be a priority, even if they are athletes. But this makes for some frank discussions and thoughts about race, masculinity, education, and sports. So while I've come to believe that the missions of higher education and that of the multi-billion-dollar college sports complex are so wholly incompatible that the marriage breeds still shady practices when it comes to taking advantage of athletes, most of whom are black males, those athletes cannot allow themselves, as long as this unethical, if not immoral system exists, to be treated and eventually dismissed as a piece of chattel, which is eventually, or essentially, what McCants did. And probably most of the overwhelming number of black athletes who play sports in college and depart it with nothing to show for it other than proof that they were at one time a baller. It has long been time for black athletes to hold colleges, particularly on the academic and administrative sides, accountable, like the Missouri football players did in 2014, when they demanded that the administration listen to the concerns of a few black students on campus, including a grad student who went on a hunger strike. It took the football team threatening not to play one weekend for the administrators to take seriously their concerns, of which the black football players reminded that they were a part. In short, Missouri had a new president and a new chancellor in short time. Let me just show you this one quick little video.
I'm resigning as president of the University of Missouri System.
This was the power of sports as agency for social change on full display. On November 2nd, a black graduate student at the University of Missouri, Jonathan Butler, said he was going on a hunger strike. He wanted to protest an increasingly inclement racial atmosphere on campus that he and other black students felt was being ignored. He demanded the president, Tim Wolfe, resign. But few of the rest of us paid attention until a group of black Missouri football players 5 days later announced they would boycott their upcoming game unless the administration acceded to Butler's demand. The social media analytics tool Topsy recorded 36 hits about Butler's protest when Butler announced his hunger strike. After the football players backed Butler, Topsy recorded over 55,000 hits. What was a regional story in Columbia, Missouri for weeks became international news overnight. And 2 days after the football players stood up, the president resigned. It was a perverted development, for it suggested the university, us in the media, and the public valued a college football game over the endangerment of a black life. And people ask what Black Lives Matter is all about. It all underscored, too, how the spotlight of sports can illuminate critical issues like nothing else. Why sports? Because sports are accessible to all of us and receive regular and worldwide media coverage. Because that coverage can attract influential allies for a cause. Because that coverage reduces the ability of regimes, whether Missouri, the Los Angeles Clippers, or the NCAA, to repress. Because sports matter. I'm Kevin Blackistone, sports columnist for The Washington Post.
And I approve of that message. Black athletes can make the image and reputation of college and university sports teams tied as much to their status as students as the conference championships and bowl and tournament berths they bring in. In other words, the McCants among black athletes are often culpable in their own lack of education due to bad choices, even if those allegations are true. And they are offered special treatment, getting in sham classes, getting grades they didn't earn, having other people do classwork for them, allowing teachers not to require them to show up in class. I can't make people show up in my class. I've had instances where I've had athletes, black athletes, basketball players, take my class, my second class, which is entitled Sports Protest in the Media. It's a class that's open to the entire campus. It's a class that I created after Colin Kaepernick went to a knee in August of 2016. The reason I created it is because I realized immediately that people did not realize that Colin Kaepernick was part of a lineage and he was not the first one to protest in sports. And that sports is a perfect petri dish for protests. That I found a quote from Cicero in 56 BC talking about the arena of gladiators being a perfect place to air grievances about government with society. So they've always gone together, and people always pay attention. But for some, they are willfully participating in their own dumbing down. living down to the stereotype of the dumb black jock, which is much dumber than the stereotype of the dumb jock. McCants didn't squander a free education. There's nothing free about practicing and playing sports for upwards of 40 hours per week in a season in exchange for not having to pay hard cash for college classes, room, and board. Anytime you hear someone say to college that the college scholarship an athlete gets is his or her free education, you tell them that that's fake news. That is misinformation. It's a damn lie. What McCants did squander was an opportunity for a college education, an opportunity to better himself, his family, black people's lives in general. He lasted just 5 seasons in the NBA. I have no idea what he's doing right now. But as a professor, I don't make my students do anything. My syllabus outlines my expectations. My students either do the work or they don't. They get out of class what they put in it. If they don't come to class, don't read, don't study, don't do assignments, they won't earn a thing. And that would be their fault. McCants could have gone to class and taken his education seriously, but what he did was allow himself to live down to the role of the black male college athlete as centralized in the academic misconduct scandals. He served to further pathologize them on campus, if not in society. What does it mean to the faces of wrongdoing in college space that they are masculine and black, and not the white coaches or administrators who perpetuated it? What is at stake if black athletes are stereotyped as being lazy, uninterested in learning, when black men are already assumed to have a proclivity for criminal activity and stupidity? I think about what NPR just asked me to comment on. Le'Veon Bell, Antonio Brown, and some of these other clowns. We've forgotten that educating black people is a revolutionary act. The teaching of slaves to read and write has a tendency to excite dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion to the manifest injury of the citizens of this state. Therefore, let it be enacted by the General Assembly of the state of North Carolina that any free person who shall hereafter teach or attempt to teach any slave within this state to read or write shall be liable to indictment in any court of record in the state, having jurisdiction thereof, and upon conviction shall, at the discretion of the court, if a white man or woman be fined not less than $100, nor more than $200, or imprisoned, or if a free person of color shall be whipped at the discretion of the court not exceeding 39 lashes, nor less than 30 lashes, be it further enacted that if any slave shall heretofore teach or attempt to teach any other slave to read or write, he or she may be carried before any justice of the peace, and upon conviction therefore be sentenced to receive 39 lashes on his or her bare back. That was a law in 1830 in North Carolina. Education, learning to read and write, make decisions, figure things out. That was penalized. And this is the 21st century. Black men need no longer be fearful of emancipating their intelligence and demanding what is rightfully theirs. Athletic departments and programs should be held accountable for academic misconduct when there is evidence to do so. But black athletes are the poster boys for these situations. Black male athletes owe it to their grandparents, their mothers, their fathers, their guardians, to progeny to come to themselves to be measured by the rest of society by something other than their 40-yard time or their vertical leap. They shouldn't choose where they will go to college based on that college appearing to be a launching pad to a professional athletic career. Only 2% of them will be so lucky to get paid by the NFL or the NBA. Instead, they should choose where to matriculate based on the graduation rates for black athletes. Whatever school they choose should be based on what those black athletes who graduated and didn't make it to the pros are doing now. Choose it based on whether the coach will support their desire to study abroad one semester, just like about any other college student. rather than having to put in every spare hour in the weight room or on the practice field. Choose it based on whether they can take afternoon lab classes instead of attend yet another team meeting. Choose it based on whether they can accept an internship, which is probably the most important prep work you can do in college if you expect to cash in on your newly minted college degree immediately upon graduating or shortly thereafter. Great football player and from a great football playing family, Leroy Selman. He played at Oklahoma, played in the NFL for a long time. One of his daughters was an outstanding basketball player, and she went to Trinity College in San Antonio, which I believe is a small liberal arts college, D3, has an outstanding reputation. And one year, the women's team was headed to the national championship. And story goes that his daughter walked into the coach's office during this championship run and explained that she would have to pull out of the tournament. Not because she was hurt, not because she wasn't playing, she was a star of the team, but because she had just been awarded the Woodrow Wilson Scholarship, a name they should probably change, at Princeton University, and that it meant that she had to go to some orientation meeting at Princeton for several days that would take her away from the team. So coach said, fine, congratulations. She went, she missed the championship. I think they won anyway. But can you imagine that happening at a Power 4 school? Star player going in and said, Coach, I got this other thing. I'm going to miss the big game. Doesn't happen. Priorities are different. Priorities are different. And black male athletes need to have those priorities. Choose it. Choose your school based on whether or not you can take full advantage of all the things the college experience has to offer, from being active in student government, theater, community service, spending spring breaks building water wells in a second world or third world country. But it's not just them. It's not just on them. It's on the rest of us as well. Parents, guardians. Way back in the day in Washington, D.C., long before I was born, when the baseball team, the Washington Senators, played at the old Griffith Stadium, which is, if you've ever been to Howard University, that's where it was. It was nestled right there. And George Preston Marshall, at the time, was best known for his dry cleaning business in Washington, D.C., rather than leading the NFL to segregate in 1933 after he purchased an NFL team in Boston and moved it to Washington, D.C., and gave it a most appropriate Native American name and logo, and then had the audacity to keep the team all white, the last all-white team in the NFL, until he was threatened by the federal government, basically at bayonet point, that unless he integrated his team, it would not be able to play, it would not be allowed to play by federal rule in a new stadium that was being built in Washington, D.C., called D.C. Stadium, then RFK Stadium. At any rate, there was a eatery on D.C.'s U Street. It was called Hamburger Grill. And it was right on the edge of Lee Droit Park in Washington, D.C., which is the most historic black neighborhood in D.C. It's all around Howard University. My father grew up on 4th Street right there. At any rate, it was a white-owned establishment on the edge of this black neighborhood. And story goes that one day, for whatever reason, the white manager fired the 3 black workers he had and hired 3 white men in their place. The Black Trio immediately began picketing the establishment. And thus was born, at least in Washington, D.C., a tactic of a burgeoning national civil rights movement that employed the slogan, "Don't buy where you can't work." So this is a truism that parents and guardians of black athletes whom college coaches are recruiting for football and basketball should be emboldened to appropriate right now. Don't play where you're not respected. In other words, don't let your son labor for a college program that doesn't support valuing black life. Go somewhere else. There are a lot of coaches, there are a lot of teams, a lot of schools. If they don't like you, don't play for them. Make somebody else wealthy off of your labor. We owe it to them to see themselves as more than, we owe it to them, our kids, to see them as more than just a get out of college debt opportunity simply because they can win an athletic scholarship, or now that they can win some NIL deal, which is the much ballyhooed acronym that allows college athletes to turn their name, image, and likeness, i.e. celebrity and fame, into cash and gifts that isn't nearly as cracked up as coaches have made them out to be, and that we in the media have advertised to the public. Once again, doing our job in the media to confuse the facts of a story. NIL is the latest trick bag in sports. The Caitlin Clarks, the Angel Reeses, and whoever plays for Deion Sanders, who he cares about, are the only ones who really have benefited from this. In fact, today there's a investigation, as best it can be, in the Washington Post into this whole NIL deal. And I just suggest you read it because there's a lot of cover-up. There's no transparency. No one really knows if the stories being told about NIL are really true. And I've, quite frankly, have doubted them since they started a few years ago. But it's another way to deflect our attention, to make us believe something that's not going on. Did you know, does anyone have any idea what the average NIL deal is on an annual basis? And I mentioned this to some people today. Not even that much, $2,400. $2,400 is the average. But about half of the NIL deals are for $100, maybe more. So when you hear about a quarterback, a point guard getting millions of dollars in valuation for NIL, maybe 1, 2 here, there. But that's not the normal case. So far, the normal case is peanuts. And the worst part about it is that coaches, athletic directors, and conference commissioners have been turned into millionaires off the revenues of black football and basketball players. And those players are not yet sharing in those revenues. And this is where we in the media have done a disservice. Because as the clamor has picked up, college athletes need to be paid. Up comes NIL, and people go, now they're being paid. But no, they're not. NIL is money you can make on your own if you can. It's like cutting a neighbor's yard. You want to make some more money? Go cut Ms. Jones's yard. You want to make some more money? Go over here and do something. But that money that you generate for us, that's staying in our pocket. We're not slicing that up. So we've confused people about that. It isn't a share of revenue, NIL. It isn't a result of some employee stock ownership plan. What black male athletes need to share in is the pie that they generate for everybody else. Unfortunately, right now, there's some court cases going on, making their way through the legal system that hopefully in a very short time will topple this whole system. College football and basketball players, again, the majority of whom are black, should be getting paychecks. They should be getting workers' comp. They should be getting health care, long-term and short, from what they bring in, just as everyone else they work for does. I was watching a football game Saturday. Now I can't remember which one. And two players on one team got knocked out with concussions. And watching the NFL last night, saw a player get stretchered off, had no movement. Football, as we know, as anyone in the NFL Players Association will tell you, union will tell you, is they call it a 100% injury sport. You just don't get hurt in the pros. You get hurt in college. You just don't get hurt in college. You get hurt in high school. But certainly, more than 1% of that $15 billion should be spent on health care for college athletes. I remember one day I was sitting I went to visit the AD at Maryland at the time, a guy named Kevin Anderson, who I'd known for a while, and I just went over there one day just to shoot the breeze with him. And we're sitting in the huge kind of foyer area where the players come in and out and all the staff and everything. And one player came by, he was on crutches. Kevin called him over and asked, he said, "How'd the surgery go?" And the player said, "Oh, it went well." He goes, "I'm used to it. This is my third one." He said, "This time they took a ligament from my elbow to put it in my other knee." And then he went on. I don't know where he is. I don't know where he is today. But that's something that's going to linger. And I was telling this other story. We were doing a panel discussion one year at Maryland about college sports and athletics and, athletes and all that. And there was a lineman who was on the panel, and he was a senior. And I can't remember if he got drafted or not, but he did play in the NFL for a few years. But at any rate, on this particular evening, we went to Q&A, and a student stood up, and she said, "I resent you getting a free education when I have to work 2 jobs to put myself through school." And she started to go on, and he said, excuse me. He said, "I put in X amount of time each week to prepare to play football at this university." He said, "Not only that, I've been on a gurney 3 times for operations so that I can continue to play in hopes of fulfilling my dream to play professionally, but more importantly, so I can continue to go to class to fulfill my mother's dream that someone in our family graduates from college." He did both. But there's agency that needs to be realized and needs to be exercised. The new 12-team college football playoff system that has so many of us, including me, excited, is expected to generate $2 billion this year. $2 billion, which is $1.4 billion more than the old playoff system of 4 teams that colleges for so long said they would never agree to, but changed their tune when bags of loot were tossed on the table. And we need not forget, as a friend of mine wrote on the cover of his book, that your brain is a muscle too. We need to emphasize that so black men can change how they are perceived in the world, which continues to be done through masculinity, physical prowess, and a reality that has made your space and life, be it in Ferguson, Missouri, New York City, Sanford, Florida, Minneapolis, St. Paul, you name the city or town, more difficult to survive in and more difficult to prosper in as a black man. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
If I might, there's so much that information you've given us and perspective that you've given us until I'm going to try to discipline myself and ask only 3 questions.
You're right.
First of all, I wish you had said something, and this is not really a critique of your presentation, about a lot of, you focus basically on college, and a lot of this starts on the sand lot with kids in elementary school, high school. Secondly, I didn't hear much about the coaches who are making multi-million dollars, the plantation owners, basically. And also, it's interesting to me, and this may be a gross generalization, but that many of your top football teams, college football teams, are in cities where the football season is the major game in town. I'm thinking about Clemson, South Carolina, where I have some relatives. And the town, if you took Clemson out, would collapse because of the football team. Thank you.
True. And the football coach at Clemson, Dabo Swinney, is dead set against sharing any of the income that he gets from being a football coach with his players. He finds that problematic. And you're hard pressed to find a state in the country where the highest paid state employee is not a football or basketball coach. And as far as the Sandlot, you know, that is where it begins. And that is where dreams start about playing whatever game it is you play like the heroes on television. And that's fine. And that's fine. But there needs to be some truth in all of that, and understand how hard it is to get to that level, what kind of discipline it takes to get to that level, which is fine, what kind of work ethic it takes to get to, which is fine. But know too that if you don't make that, if you're not that 2%, then you need to get something out of all of this time that you've spent, which kind of culminates in college. And so that's where you need to at least get that stamp of approval of higher education. You need to get that paper. And you need to financially benefit from that time. Because for most athletes, that's their greatest window of opportunity. That's their greatest window of opportunity. It's not the professional level. So if everybody, if you think about it, if you go to any college game, first thing you do is you buy a ticket. Then you have to buy a parking pass. Then you get inside, you buy some refreshments. Then you take your seat next to people who did all the same thing. And then you look down on the field and you see the referees or officials who are getting paid for doing their job. You look up in the press box, we're getting paid for covering you. You look at the coaches, whoever's under the headsets or with clipboards, they're getting paid. Everybody's getting paid except the people you came to watch play. It's a crazy system. I don't even know if you don't even need an MBA not to go broke running college sports.
There is a course I teach, first year writing seminar, and the title is Educational Innovations in Africa and the African Diaspora. And beside doing the writing, I encourage them every year, every time I teach it, to identify at Cornell some topics that they think there should be a need for an innovation. And I was struck by how often the topic of reforming the right and benefit of the athletes. And not many students are athletes in the group. So these are students who come from high school, as Professor Harris was mentioning. So if these young people know what is wrong, what is unethical, what is inequitable, what would it take to transform the system?
That's a great question. You know, part of it is not to believe the hype. And that's easy to say, but what does that mean? You know, parents, guardians, talking about the Sandlot, have to be as enthusiastic, I think, with their kids learning as they are about them being stars on the field or whatever sport that they're in. Have to let them know that the two go together. And they have to be the adults all along. I forgot who I was having this conversation with, and we were talking about, it was Renee today. We were talking about the uncomfortableness of hearing a player talk about his coach in fatherly phrases. You know, my coach is like a father to me. No, your coach is like a coach to you. Your father, your guardian is like a father or your guardian to you. And, you know, players get inculcated in the system the longer that they're in it. And so it's hard to get them to think differently. That's a real challenge. When you spend that much time in a sport and with coaches who are trained in psychology, know how to motivate you, know how to make you think, know how to make you run through that wall. That's really difficult. The good news is that there's some people who have figured that out. Most notably, a guy by the name of Ramogi Huma, who was a defensive back at UCLA in 1999, and ever since then has started an organization in an attempt to unionize college players, and he's had tremendous success. And he was behind the unionization movement at Northwestern. I think he was behind the unionization movement of athletes at Dartmouth. He's been on the forefront of this re-education and on getting college athletes their rightful due. And so it's tough. It's quite the slog, but there are some people like him and the lawyers who have picked up some of these cases who are doing the right thing.
My question is more about journalism. I was a reporter for several years before I came into grad school. I started off in investigations. Then I was a foreign correspondent based in Dakar, so Senegal, covering the West Africa region. I think one of the hardest things, though, is how do you keep your voice through that sort of process, right? You're coming under pressure from editors, from publications, corporate media. They don't want to talk about race. They don't want to talk about colonialism. They don't want to talk about these issues. So how have you managed to keep your voice coming from the background you've come from all the way through to now where you're delivering this lecture, this very hard-hitting, even fiery lecture today? I'm really interested in you answering that.
I was fortunate enough to come up in a political household. My father was very, very involved in politics in PG County, Maryland, just outside of D.C. So these types of conversations were always going on. And when I knew in high school that I wanted to be a journalist, I wanted to do so because I had come to an understanding about giving voice to the voiceless, and understanding that journalism is critically important to people of color and marginalized people. And that got reinforced for me when I was at Northwestern. And as I said, I went to work for this publication that focused on racial and social issues. And so that was always my prism. Even when I was covering economics, right? That's why I called Manning Marable, because nobody was calling Manning Marable. Nobody could find black economists, right? Amazing. So to get their viewpoint on everyday economic issues. And quite frankly, I would feel as if I were doing the business, and certainly myself, a disservice if I didn't use that prism to analyze sports, because otherwise I'd be doing it like everyone else, right? I would overlook the inability of black athletes to ascend to be coaches and general managers, right? I would overlook the fact that broadcasters often will fall into descriptions about black athletes and white athletes that are completely different. That black athletes aren't cerebral, and that white athletes are. That black athletes are naturally fast and strong. That white athletes have to work at it. I could write about it every day. But you know what's interesting? Back in the early 90s, when I started writing a column, there were probably 4 other black columnists at major newspapers in the country. At that time, there were probably like 1,500 major newspapers. There was Mike Wilbon, there was Bill Rhoden, there was the late, great Brian Burwell, and I can't remember who the other one may have been. Who? It could have been. Yeah, I can't remember quite the year. But, all of us kind of had the same kind of mindset. And so we would question things. We would point things out. So now, fast forward, and 5, 6, 7 years ago, ESPN starts an entire site dedicated to sport, race, and culture, which they called The Undefeated and is now called Anscape. So I think people have kind of come around. And before us, it was Ralph Wiley, who really pressed looking at sport through another lens. And then I read Harry Edwards, who's not in the great of health right now, sadly. And I got to know Harry Edwards a little bit, and if you're a black athlete and you don't have the Revolt of the Black Athlete, go out and get it. It just published, 50th anniversary just a few years ago. And there's a new foreword to the book. Go out and get it. I was just with Tommy Smith a week ago because there's a artist out of L.A. By the name of Glenn Kino, and he's done several art projects with Tommy Smith. And the latest one was just unveiled this summer at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, right in downtown D.C. And it's Glenn Kino took a cast of Tommy Smith's right arm from here up in the fist, and gold-plated it. And he has 200 of them, 1 to 200 meters. They go in this beautiful undulating sculpture hanging from the ceiling. And I've interviewed Tommy Smith before, but it was the first time I got to meet him. And man, he's better in person. And when you go back and look at the interviews of Tommy Smith going into the 60th Olympics and coming and immediately after the 60th Olympics. You can Google it and find it. And you understand how knowledgeable he was about what it was he was planning to do and what it was he did, right? He studied. That's the other thing. I mean, that's why you got to study. Colin Kaepernick spent some time in the off season auditing a class at some California college, and I can't remember which one. But at any rate, supposedly the book that really made him understand the situation was Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins. You know, so go pick that up, right? That's not going to be, no one's going to be handing that to athletes, read Black Feminist Thought. But he did it, you know? So, I mean, you got to keep you just got to keep your focus. That's the way I've been able to do it.
As you were speaking, I began to think too about like the casualties of these systems. Back to the case of Botham Jean and Joshua Brown, that young man who had been an athlete in Florida and who testified, and within 10 days he's gone. But when I hear the phrase, say his name for Botham Jean, I also am always inclined to say the name of Joshua Brown, because these kinds of people have so frequently slipped through the cracks or had the broken dreams, even as they were, you know, so promising. I want to ask just about questions of democracy and the narrative in short. Maybe getting back to some of what Professor Harris mentioned, in the sense that, yes, this notion of Friday Night Lights is often framed as a mechanism for bringing people together, for bridging racial divides, and yet instill an integrated football field or basketball court is never an indication of how much institutions are truly integrated and democratized. And so there's a kind of national fantasy operative. The film Invictus from 2009 stands out in terms of how this narrative played out at the highest levels in South Africa. And it's true, I think, that sports can give us a sense of what's possible in terms of bridging cultural divides. But if there's not a concomitant effort to really open up these institutions to the excluded, then not much is gained. And then just as an addendum, that, I guess, going to the heart of questions of democracy at another level, we had that, the Georgia Senate race where Herschel Walker was foregrounded as a candidate in competition with Raphael Warnock. And I posted in social media several times about almost like the absurdity of it. But it is premised on a lot of the stereotypes, I think, of Black athleticism that have been internalized by the Republican Party. And in this instance, they were weaponized in some cases. So if you have anything about that to say, I would be interested.
Oh, absolutely. You know, we have, in another lecture, I talk about kind of the fallacy of Jackie Robinson, right? You know, one of the most brilliant marketing deals ever done in this country is by Major League Baseball. And it is to whitewash the Jackie Robinson story, right? They decided in the early 1990s, sometime around then, to celebrate Jackie Robinson. And they never really got around to talking about the 60 years before Jackie Robinson, in which they accepted the mantle of America's pastime by being a sport that only white men could play. And the perniciousness of that is that there are two things. One, baseball was integrated. It was integrated. And a guy by the name of Cap Anson, who's the greatest baseball figure of the 19th century, convinced baseball to draw the color line. And baseball was so powerful that it encouraged other sports to do the same. You know, basketball grew up as an all-white sport. NFL was integrated, decided to segregate in 1933. Jack Johnson, first black man allowed to fight for the heavyweight championship of the world, wins it. All hell breaks loose. And then it would be 2 decades pass before another black man would be allowed to fight for the championship. 13 of the 15 jockeys in the first Kentucky Derby, 1875, I believe, were all black. Jim Crow ran them out of the sport. Everyone following baseball's lead. And so I always argue, we have given, for some reason, we have given sport the medal for being in the vanguard of social change. But it hasn't been in the vanguard of social change. It's been a laggard. It's been a laggard when it comes to integration, when it comes to LGBTQ rights, when it comes to anything. It's followed the path. It didn't break down Jim Crow. It joined a movement that was already afoot in the 1940s. It was just another piece. It was just another piece. And it gets used, to your example, as a model for progress, particularly when it comes to racial progress. And so athletes get promoted as being able to earn gobs of money, and as if that's some indication that poverty has been eliminated within black communities. And so that's a problem. Damian Thomas, who you probably know, who's the curator of the sports wing at the African American Museum in DC, he wrote an interesting book, I think it was from his dissertation, on how the federal government used black athletes during the Cold War to present a false narrative to the rest of the world as to how well this country was doing in race relations. And that's true. That's true in so many sports. So yeah, Herschel Walker, all these, Jim Brown. People are forgetting about Jim Brown right now. Jim Brown went to meet with Donald Trump. I was like, this isn't the Jim Brown I grew up with. So how did this happen? Yeah, how did this happen? So it's interesting. Although I must say, listening to, I can't remember if it was Le'Veon Bell now or Antonio Brown, the wide receiver. Maybe it was Antonio Brown. Listen to what he had to say in terms of lending his support. I was like, that's not going to work. Fortunately, it was not that brilliant. So.
One of the things that I'm walking away with, similar to your feeling, is like this pessimism. And if we live in this capitalist society, how can changes really happen? Because if the bottom line is money and there's no share about it, the way you broke it down, what change is really going to happen? Because I love what you said about Jackie Robinson. I was raised in Brooklyn in the 60s. And I remember the stories about Jackie. And I'm old enough to remember that he was blind at the end of his life. Diabetes caught him, and he aged because of what he took. And baseball don't talk about that part of the story. And the last public appearance that I know he made was at one of the World Series, where he begged that there be a black manager before he died. Unfortunately, that did not happen. So how are we going to make these changes take place when we live in a society that's structured based on this plantation mentality? Anyway, that's all I got to say, because I could talk all day, but I'm not.
Yeah, people forget Jackie Robinson was court-martialed for refusing to move in his seat when he was in Texas, I believe. Where was it? Arkansas. Yeah. And that last speech he gave as a broken man is tough to watch. So, yeah, what do we do? How do you work? How do you become socialistic in a capitalist system? Ask the NFL. NFL doesn't have any problem with socialism. And this isn't socialism. This is just fairness. This is just fairness. I was at a meeting. There's an organization called the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, and it's a think tank type of group made up of current ADs, coaches, former ADs, coaches, that lot. And I was at this one meeting one time, and they're trying to figure out what to do, going over the problems. And it's a public kind of a forum. And Charles Young was there. And Charles Young was a retired president of, he was a president of UCLA back in the 60s, then Florida, and I can't remember what other institution, but highly respected. And people are batting around these ideas. They're arguing about this, that, and the other. Not heated, but just debating. And finally, Charles Young just said, the problem is there's too much money. He just said it like that. He said, until you figure out how to equitably share the revenues, you're going to have a problem. And so that's where college sports is right now. They're being forced to finally equitably share the money. And I think that within the next year, that will be done, because I think Johnson versus the NCAA, House versus the NCAA, both of which basically will say that college athletes are employees, will break the back of the camel. But something people have to get accustomed to. But I think that's the way to do it. Thank you, Professor Black. Thank you.